Hi, I'm Aaron Kimberly. I'm a 50-year-old trans man, a gender diversity consultant, and executive director of the Gender Dysphoria Alliance. I medically transitioned in 2006. I'd like to give you a bit of a history of how we've understood ideas like gender identity and trans over the years. I'll start with early research and how the gender identity theory started, and then move into more modern concepts like gender identity disorder and queer theory. The early research by psychologists and psychiatrists, where all this started, was in the treatment of rare medical conditions called intersex, or disorders of sex development. Back then, when a baby was born with sex organs that didn't look clearly male or female, the doctor assigned a sex. They were most often assigned as female because it's easier to surgically create the appearance of female genitals than to construct male genitals. And what they found was most of those babies grew up and adapted pretty well to whichever sex they were assigned. This work led to the theory that there's nothing hardwired in our brains that tell us I'm a boy or I'm a girl, but we learn that socially and by observing differences between males and females and being told whether we're a boy or a girl. This social learning is what the psychologists called a gender identity. It simply means a person's awareness of the fact that they are male or female and our culture's expectations for what men and women are like. So when they told parents of an intersex baby, raise this child as female, that child would develop an awareness of self as female based on what they were being told by others. But then these psychologists started to see people who didn't have intersex conditions coming to the clinics saying they wanted to change sex, or insisting that they were in fact the opposite sex. Those who were working at those clinics noticed that there were two very different groups of people showing up. There were kids, both boys and girls, brought in by their parents, and there were middle-aged men. For the kids, their belief that they were the opposite sex usually started around age 3, so psychologists called this early onset gender identity disorder. These kids were very gender nonconforming, which was observed by others. When researchers and clinicians followed those kids over time, they found that pretty much all of the boys and most of the girls became gay or lesbian. And about 85% of those kids stopped believing they were the opposite sex once they developed a gay or lesbian identity. The group of men, on the other hand, had been quite typical boys, often very masculine and usually straight, or sometimes bisexual. Their desire to become women started later in life, in their teens or as adults, though they may have experimented with cross-dressing earlier in life. So this group we could call late-onset gender identity disorder. Research on this group has shown that what they are experiencing is an attraction to women that gets turned around onto themselves, kind of like a boomerang, so that they become attracted to the idea of being women. No one really knows yet why this happens, but it can lead to intense discomfort or disgust with their own bodies. The community used to have two separate names for these groups. The gay adults who transitioned were called homosexual transsexuals, and the heterosexual men were called transvestites. There were far more transvestites than transsexuals, since most of the kids with gender identity disorder outgrew those feelings by the time they were adults. At that time, kids weren't being offered hormones or surgery. Then, in the early 1990s, a new way of thinking started in North American universities called queer theory. This political group believes that all categories like male and female and straight or gay are harmful, so they set out to confuse and break apart categories. They did this by starting to change the meaning of words, creating new words, and using their own appearance as a type of gender-bending performance. One of the first things that happened with this political movement was the grouping of transsexuals and transvestites together under one new word, transgender, or trans for short. Then all kinds of new labels were created, like genderqueer. Since then, dozens or even hundreds of new identity labels have been created, like demisexual and frog gender. These are being called gender identities, which is quite different from how the psychologists were using that term. Anyone who believed in this political movement could now find or invent a label for themselves, and trans has become an umbrella term for anyone with any one of these new labels, even if they never had a gender identity disorder. These ideas were, and still are, attractive to people for all kinds of reasons, and we've seen the trans category grow and grow, especially among girls. So while middle-aged male transvestites used to be the largest group of trans-identified people, teens and young women are now the largest group and rapidly growing, and often being medicalized along with those rare intersex conditions or gender identity disorder, which is now called gender dysphoria. One of the harms being done by changing the meaning of gender identity is that kids with early onset gender dysphoria are being medically transitioned at a young age and not being given a chance to grow up to be gay or lesbian as they did in the past. This has become very concerning for many psychologists, doctors, parents, and the gay and lesbian community. For more information about gender dysphoria, please visit www.genderdysphoriaalliance.com.